I'm back to talk about my OCs, but not the ones I introduced in my New Year's video. I teased another project at the end of that video, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. I don't have a lot developed yet, but I still think it's worth presenting. Firstly, because it'll force me to work on it if I want to upload more than one video about it this year. Secondly, because I want to be able to juggle multiple projects at once. For a very long time, reigning champion was my one thing. I worked exclusively on that and had no space in my head for other stories, which meant that all of my creative explorations happened within that one project. But because it never amounted to anything, I never got a sense of accomplishment or a chance to learn from my experiences. In general, I want to get in the habit of making low investment short comics and stuff, kind of like when I was at school and had to turn in a new short comic once every 2 or 3 months. That said, I'm pretty bad at thinking of stories that can exist within 10 or 20 pages at most. So this is another big one that's going to take me years to develop before I can produce it. It may seem counterintuitive to share something that won't see the light of day in years, but there's always the possibility that I don't see this project to its completion. If that ends up being the case, at least it'll exist as videos. Like in the New Year's video, I'm going to explain the general idea of the story, some characters, as well as some stuff relating to the creative process like my motivations and goals. For some context, this is technically my third attempt at developing this story. I originally made it after I watched Hunter x Hunter and wanted to make a shonen-esque story with a majority female cast, but I'm a guy who needs themes to stay interested. Without a driving purpose, it's no surprise that my motivation fizzled out pretty quickly. The only things I had was the basic idea of a setting, which is a fantasy magic school, and some character dynamics. I was inspired to revamp the story after being pretty disappointed with recent fantasy reads, but spite isn't my only motivator. In fact, it hardly even counts as one at this point, since it's not a feeling I hold on to. I intend to tackle things that I've personally been thinking a lot about as someone in the diaspora, feeling somewhat removed from my own culture, following the movement of reconnecting with one's heritage and decolonizing. I'll talk about that more in detail later. First, I'd like to present my concept. Study of Magic is the working title because it takes place in a school and magic is involved, but academia isn't the focus. The setting is a fantasy inspired by Spanish colonial era Philippines, which is unfortunately all I can say as I haven't yet done the necessary research to really world build. Since I don't have names for anything, I'll just be calling the island nation the archipelago, the natives Indio, and the colonizers will be referred to as Westerners and settlers. As for the story, we follow Talna, a young woman from a closed-off mountain community. She grew up accustomed to supernatural occurrences as she comes from a very spiritual lineage, so when a dangerous magical incident occurs that neither she nor her family understands, it's cause for alarm. I've yet to figure out what it is exactly, but I know that it pushes Talna to investigate, leading her to find a connection with the Westerners. Against the wishes of her family, she goes to the magic school in the colonial capital in hopes of finding out what it is and making sure it no longer poses a threat to her home. Lacking credentials, she normally wouldn't be admitted to the school, so I'm thinking she runs into a scholar on the way and helps her. She would offer Talna a place in the school as thanks. As much as she'd like to focus on her investigation, she's a total fish out of water and sticks out like a sore thumb, which isn't conducive to snooping around and staying out of trouble. Right now, I've thought of 2 people who would help her, not including the aforementioned researcher. The core cast could expand, it might not, I don't know yet. On the subject of the cast, let's introduce the characters I have figured out so far. Starting off with Talna, the protagonist. Something I'd like to note before I talk about her character is that while she clearly takes inspiration from Igorot peoples of the Philippines, I haven't yet chosen a specific ethnic group to take influence from. Her name may be subject to change since right now it's an Ilocano word, but whenever I narrow down who she takes inspiration from, I may change her name to reflect that. I have more to say on this subject, but I'll save that for the world building segment. She used to be your standard shonen protagonist. Outgoing, stubbornly optimistic, and full of potential. She solved her problems with the power of friendship and/or unrelenting brute force. Now, she's a bit of an inversion of her old self, more timid and cautious with no innate magical powers to speak of. Both the West and the archipelago have their own separate forms of magic that I'll explain later. What's important to note for now is that the way they function and their philosophies are polar opposites. Meaning, Talna can't exactly gain recognition within the school via conventional means, so she has to find other ways to access the information and resources she needs without attracting too much suspicion. If she were a cunning mastermind type of person, this wouldn't really be a problem, but back home, she wasn't really one to go against the grain, always listening to her parents and elders. This is her first time being truly independent, and she's navigating that in an environment that is actively hostile and condescending to her. I still want the power of friendship to be her biggest strength, be it with other disenfranchised people within the school or supernatural beings that are still in the area. Talna isn't used to people being so uncooperative, not just with her, but with each other. She comes from a tight-knit community. There would obviously be disputes and rivalries, but they were never to the extent of the school, encouraging people to step over and sabotage one another. While she can't do much herself in the environment she finds herself in, her kindness attracts a lot of people who can help her. One such person is Elvira, who happens to be the daughter of the scholar Talna helped. Originally, Elvira was conceptualized as a foil to Talna and contrasted her in every way. Where Talna was social, Elvira was reserved. Where Talna was the bronze, she was the brains, and so on. This contrast is still present, but now Elvira is the one with the bold personality and exceptional magical talents to back it up. She actually grew up in the West and is the most talented magic user among her peers. You wouldn't normally find someone like her in the archipelago. However, recently, she's been experiencing fever-like symptoms that no doctor can explain or cure, as well as supernatural occurrences that aren't tied to her study of magic. Elvira is actually a mestiza woman. Right now, I'm thinking that her conception was a bit of a scandal and her mother, who is mestiza herself, was forced to return to the West as punishment. I'm undecided as to who exactly her father is and if he's alive. The one thing I know for sure is that Elvira never knew him, and she finds herself in the archipelago looking for answers. Because of her lineage, she grew up with a chip on her shoulder, aiming to be the very best among her peers to prove that her parentage has no bearing on her skills or right to respect. She even keeps her father's surname out of spite. She has a very proud and assertive personality. Nothing could really stand in her way for long. So when she's met with a problem that she can't deal with right away or by herself, it really gets to her. She's not very optimistic about finding solutions for what she's experiencing, seeing as she's so disconnected from the magic of the archipelago. She doesn't know who to turn to and feels powerless for the first time in a long time. She only starts to feel like she can turn things around once Talna enters the picture. Every community within the archipelago has their own way of doing things, so while Talna can't truly guide her like a proper mentor, she knows enough to ease Elvira's confusion. Elvira, in turn, is sympathetic to Talna as she's also viewed as an outsider by the school, so she does her best to help her get her way whenever she can. For the most part, this takes the form of using her reputation and abilities to either use facilities within the school that Talna can't access on her own, or intimidating people into leaving her alone. Last character I have figured out is Serafina, Elvira's cousin. She doesn't actually have a direct equivalent from my first couple iterations, but when thinking of how to contrast her from the other two, I thought of one of my former, severely underdeveloped characters. I had a bard character who was flirty, but also, get this, asexual. So she inherited those traits, being a bit of a charmer and having a playful attitude, but the only thing she's really interested in pursuing is knowledge. She also grew up in the West, sharing an Indio grandparent with Elvira who planted within her an interest for the archipelago. I'm not exactly sure what Serafina studies. I'm thinking anthropology, linguistics, or both. Either way, when she hears her cousin is off to the archipelago, she drops everything to accompany her. She doesn't have any magical talents to speak of, which she never really cared for, but when she learns her cousin was beginning to display a connection to the archipelago's magic, she couldn't help but feel a little jealous. That said, she knows she has it easier than Elvira, capable of playing the part of the ideal Western lady, familiar with the etiquette, and more than capable of meeting the expectations others have of her. She could live her life very comfortably in comparison. But of course, she isn't content with that. A lot of it comes from her closeness to her Indio grandparent. She identifies more strongly with the culture of the archipelago, even if, up until that point, she had never been. Unfortunately for her, when she gets there, she doesn't exactly fit in either due to her status. Despite that, she's still the most social of the three, oftentimes acting as a coordinator between people on account of being multilingual and naturally charismatic. So she happens to know a lot about the goings-on of the school, relationships, tensions, and who to go to for certain things. Serafina and Elvira were never really close, and seeing as they're opposites, you'd think they wouldn't get along. While they are often at odds, I think they hold a mutual respect for one another that keeps them from really developing any bad blood. As for her dynamic with Talna, they're friendly, but Serafina isn't as willing to be vulnerable with her as Elvira is. That's all I have to say about the core cast for now. I want to focus, for the most part, on fleshing out the plot as much as possible, so that I'll know what I need of the world when it's time to develop it and do some research. But that doesn't mean I have absolutely nothing. Considering the importance of magic, that's one of the things I'm already trying to figure out before fine-tuning it with research. Admittedly, the magic of the archipelago comes to me more easily than the magic of the West. The archipelago's magic is highly relational. Everything is alive, and if you want something of the land, you have to respect it and give it something in return. I'm very adamant about the Indios having no inherent magical abilities. Some people may have a stronger sensitivity to the supernatural, meaning stronger communication, not the ability to tangibly manipulate the elements or something. Nothing wrong with giving Filipino characters innate magical powers, I just want to put more emphasis on the necessity to rely on supernatural beings to perform supernatural feats. I feel like the relational aspect of Filipino spirituality reality is often underexplored in fantasy. Anyway, in contrast, the magic of the West is all about control. While I know that I want the focus of Western magic to be on an individual's ability to manipulate it, I haven't yet decided what that looks like. I could go a lot of ways about it. Maybe have branches of magic like you see in D&D, do something really technical like alchemy, or stay simple and stick to elemental magic. Either way, the point is for these philosophies to be inherently conflicting. The West views the archipelago's magic as unreliable, while the archipelago views the West's use of magic as disrespectful. Which does beg the question of why the West would want to settle in the archipelago, and why the archipelago would tolerate the presence of the West. For the settlers, I'm thinking along the lines of magic being treated as a resource. It could be like water, where there's technically an infinite amount of it, but you can only access it at certain points and it needs to be refined to a certain quality to be usable. Naturally, they would want to own and exploit every possible well of magic that exists in the world. In exchange, they bring their technologies with them, like magic industrial agricultural tools, medicine, and quality of life stuff like, I don't know, magic air conditioning and electricity. The trade-off is that your well-being is placed in the hands of colonizers rather than local deities, but they made it seem very attractive to rely on fellow humans who definitely do care about you rather than fickle, unknowable spirits. While I'm going to be drawing a lot of inspiration from Spanish colonial era Philippines, this is still supposed to be an original fantasy. I don't want this to be a one-to-one copy of history with a few names changed. For instance, considering the Catholic Church would probably view the foundational magic of the West as sacrilege, and my conceptualization of the West isn't extremely religious for the time being, it'd be unwise to carry over the religious aspect as is. Speaking of adapting things, this also brings me to the subject of Talna's culture. I know for a fact that I can't accurately depict a specific ethnic group among the Igorot people, and given that this is a fantasy, there are going to be inaccuracies baked into my world. I can't transpose an entire culture into my work without adapting it in some way. The question is how to go about doing that respectfully. I could pull from commonalities between the various indigenous groups of the Cordilleras region to make up a fantasy equivalent, but to my mind, that promotes a sort of generalization of indigenous peoples, which I'd like to avoid. I'm going to stick to picking a specific reference and see from there how I can balance accurate and respectful depictions with fabrications for the sake of fantasy. Everyone is going to have a different opinion on this, so I don't expect anyone to come to a consensus and tell me the optimal way to do representation. That said, if you are an indigenous person, of the Philippines or otherwise, I am interested in hearing what you think. Ultimately, the most important thing is to treat Talna like her own character and not a monolith for an entire demographic, which is why I'm not yet getting in the weeds of figuring out who exactly it is she takes inspiration from. On the topic of inspirations and intentions, I do want to talk about my goals for this story. With the main character being an indigenous person and the core conflict being related to the influences of colonizers, it's fair to assume that my message is something along the lines of needing to oust them, removing their influence, and returning to an indigenous way of life. Obviously, colonization is bad, but I don't mean to suggest that the solution is as simple as turning back the clock and pretending it had no impact on our culture whatsoever. In my story, the colony would have been established for a century or three already. As someone who is looking for a sense of cultural belonging and is disillusioned by the world we live in today, I'm susceptible to idealizing the past, oversimplifying history, and insisting that the only way to fix our society is to go back to the way things were. I say something that would imply that's a belief I have in my last video. It's my bad for expressing myself poorly. It's truer to say that I'm frustrated by people who say we can't connect to or learn from our history. I'm thinking of people who look down on our indigenous ancestors, who would sooner claim Spanish ancestry and believe that the colonization was actually a good thing. But I also don't believe in denying the parts of our culture that adapted to colonization. The Filipino identity is inherently a colonial one, and for my story, I want to focus on the associated grief and guilt that can come with knowing that about yourself. At least those are feelings that I have and want to explore. Obviously, I understand that when a magical chosen one throwing out usurpers is the focus of other stories, the topics I'm bringing up aren't all that relevant. While there's nothing wrong with stories where the good guys beat the bad guys, with a clear-cut message like colonization bad, I just can't help but wish there were more fantasies, especially adult fantasies, focused on more personal and complicated experiences. Maybe that's just not the genre to do it in. Plus, I'm working off of the rather small sample sizes of books that I've read, so there could be a plethora of books like that I just haven't seen yet. It could also be that I'm the only one who's struggling to figure out what it means for me to reconnect with my heritage, but that won't prevent me from exploring those feelings through Elvira and Serafina. As for Talna, her role isn't to give them an answer or permission to reclaim their culture. She's an individual. That's not her responsibility, and she doesn't even belong to the same ethnic group as them. Part of her struggle will be having to deal with others expecting and wanting so much from her because of who she is. I have a vague idea for the main antagonist and what direction I want the plot to head in, but I'd rather develop that stuff a little more before sharing anything. Because of how vague everything is, it might be too soon to consider what form this project should take if I manage to start production in the future. But I have to set a concrete goal if I ever want this thing to really go anywhere. Truthfully, I'm not sure if I want the story to be a comic. Maybe it will be, but that feels like defaulting to the medium because I know it rather than because I'm seriously interested in what I can do with the story in that form. Otherwise, considering how much I mentioned reading, it might be fair to consider the written format and make a novel or something. While I do write from time to time, and I read enough to know what I do and don't enjoy in writing, even if it's only in a vague sense as opposed to a technical understanding of the craft, I don't think writing is any easier than making a comic. It's definitely a different type of effort, but it's still a lot of effort, and I'm not sure I have it in me to tackle a purely written project. I could certainly try. I think if I end up doing something more text-heavy, I would still want to incorporate illustrations in some way. What's funny about this project is that it was originally conceptualized as something simple that I could do as practice for reigning champion, but it ended up becoming an equally intimidating project. I'm not sure which of the two I would want to produce first. At the moment, I'm sort of developing both of them simultaneously, so I guess it depends on which one I complete first and feel more compelled to work on at any given time. Related to setting concrete goals, I feel like I have an easier time imagining a project going further if I have an associated title, and I do not like study of magic. I really want to change it, even if whatever else I come up with only ends up being a placeholder as well. I have a few keywords that are a better fit in my opinion, I just haven't yet found a combination of words that I like. I especially want to avoid the thing of thing and thing fantasy novel title convention. It's to a point where it's kind of goofy to me. Otherwise, I only got around to working on this story for the sake of this video. I imagine I will have an easier time once I have a better title. I'm definitely not making excuses. That's all I have for now. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. It'll probably be a while before I make another video about this project. You could subscribe so you'll be sure to catch that video in maybe 6 months. But if you want to follow the progress of my projects more closely, you could check out my Ko-fi, where I intend to post project updates for certain membership tiers as well as other perks, such as being shouted out at the end of my video, like Noelle and Andromeda in the Calico Cat tier. Members in the Tabby Cat tier or higher can also influence my videos via suggestions and polls, which is currently all at the whims of my 2 friends, so maybe join the tier if you'd like to change that. If you don't want to commit to a monthly membership, but you'd like to support me and happen to like my art, consider commissioning me. But if you don't have the money for it or simply don't want to, that's fine. I appreciate you watching. You can also follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky or check out my scuffed website if you're not into social media. Thanks again. I'll be back next month, normally.